There's a strict instruction from our chair lady of the Namibian Scientific Society, not of the Namibian Environment and Wildlife Society. Okay, so that was Ruth Molzio, and we are here in the hall of the Namibian Scientific Society, and very grateful to that. Thank you, Ruth. We are the Namibian Environment and Wildlife Society. This is the news at 7, as we have tried to have on a monthly basis, but we skipped last month and we're having 2 in quick succession this week and next week. We're an environmental NGO. We try to raise awareness about interesting things that are going on environmentally and often scientifically with young people, young students, giving us talks, as we're going to have next week, on interesting conservation things going on. Just 1 or 2 announcements before we start. We have got copies of the Atlas of Namibia, that wonderful book, which costs a lot of money, but you can get it at a reduced price through News if you are a member. So if you're not a member, join News and then buy your cheaper copy of the Atlas. Available for $550 at the back. Josephine is our assistant in charge of the bar there, and she can also arrange that. If you're not a member of News, please do consider joining us. We do these monthly talks. We are trying to get outings arranged a bit more regularly, and we kind of try to keep awareness raising about, well, we try to keep raising awareness about environmental issues in Namibia. So this evening we are talking giraffes. Okay, Sven's got his hand up. Hello. Then you have to 250 if you are young and sprightly, and if you're a pensioner, then we give you a reduced rate. Yeah, but it's a bargain, is the main point. Okay, so tonight we're talking giraffes, and we've got the Giraffe Conservation Fund who like to fill the slot on the shortest day of the year to talk about the tallest animal on Earth. So we've got 2 of the kind of eminent members of the GCF addressing us this evening. Julian Fennessy started Giraffe Conservation Foundation a number of years ago, and he'll be addressing us first. And then we've got Dr. Michael Brown. Julian is also Dr. Julian Fennessy. Then we've got Dr. Michael Brown, who's from the States and doing giraffe science here in Namibia. So just briefly, Julian Fennessy has been in and out of Namibia. He first came here in 1997, started with the Ministry of Youth, did environmental education stuff, worked with the Desert Research Foundation on a project up in the Northwest, various things there. Finally realized that he really wanted to concentrate on giraffes. So he established the Giraffe Conservation Foundation in 2009. He's also been the executive director of the NNF, Namibian Nature Foundation, but now he is the director of conservation in the Giraffe Conservation Fund. And Steph with is she also Fennessy? Fennessy. Okay, Steph Fennessy is the executive director of the Giraffe Conservation Foundation. We also have Dr. Michael Brook, who's from the USA, has been here since, did I write that down, since 2014? Is that right? Okay, I beg your pardon. Anyway, now lives in Windhoek, has got a master's and a PhD in various aspects of ecology. Sorry, speak into the microphone. And did a postdoc with the Smithsonian had a conservation scientist fellowship there. So it's well qualified to address us about various ecological aspects of giraffes. We've got, for those people who are on Zoom, we've got about 30 people. Am I being optimistic here? 20, 30 people in the audience, and the number of people, I hope, listening on Zoom. This is the first time we're trying this virtual stuff. We've done little Facebook things in the past which haven't worked very well, so we're doing this in collaboration with the Scientific Society a bit more professionally, and I hope it works. So thumbs held. Thank you, Ruth, for manning the thing there, and Ruth will pipe up if there's any questions that need desperate attention while we're talking. I think over to you. Julian, you're going to start? And my name's John.
John Pallett. Thank you, John. Thank you, News. It's fantastic to be here. We've given a few talks over the years, and obviously each time it's a little bit of update of what we do, where we do it, and how we do it across the continent. Have funny accents. So I'm an Aussie by trade. So if anyone likes cricket, it was a very good finish to the game yesterday. But really, so myself, Michael here tonight, just to give you a bit of an update. But it's great. We've got friends and colleagues from around the conservation sector here. We've got other GCF staff members here, some ex as well. We don't need to talk to Claire too much. So, but I'm just going to give you a 101 of giraffe conservation to start with, and then Michael's going to go into the detail. World Giraffe Day today. The longest day if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, or the longest night if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. So years ago, Steph, my wife, and I were sitting down trying to figure out what's a good day. And in all honesty, it started because the news were asking us, what is World Giraffe Day? What can we put it on the calendar? And it seriously started here in Namibia, sat on the couch, had a beer or two, and just thought, well, what do we do? And I said the 21st of December. As an Aussie, of course, that makes perfect sense. And my wife literally called me an idiot and said, there is no money in the Southern Hemisphere. So let's make it the Northern Hemisphere. So the 21st of June, the longest day for the tallest animal. And it's been 10 years this year, this sort of journey so far. And it's all about education, awareness, raising support, fundraising. And we've been quite lucky that especially the zoo world out there picked it up and has run with it. So even this year, I think it was really good in the media in Namibia. I kept hearing it on the radio, seeing it in the newspaper. It's lovely that World Giraffe Day is obviously getting a bit of attention. So giraffe in general, obviously have been around for a long time. Give or take about 2 million years is current modern giraffe. Other giraffe and giraffid looking critters have been around for a lot longer. The Okapi, which is in the DRC, its closest relative, is about 11 million years it's been hanging around on Earth. But here in Namibia, this is up in Tweefontein, obviously there's been a strong, close affinity with humans and with giraffe for many, many years. Giraffe live in an amazing array of landscapes. This is in Kenya. This is Mount Kenya behind. The reticulated giraffe there, quite dense, lush environment in certain areas, through to Uganda and the Murchison Falls National Park. This is the Nubian giraffe, and across into places like Chad. This is Zakuma National Park in Chad and the Kordofan giraffe. But you can see the vegetation is really varied. And so giraffe, it's just not cookie cutter approach. They live in one place, so therefore they must live in another, especially when they essentially live in fresh air and sunshine in northwest Namibia. Has anyone been up to the Wanab River? I'm sure a few of you have been out that part of the world. Very beautiful. I really don't understand what they live on at times, but this is just outside the Wanab on the plains north of it. And giraffe seem to survive exceptionally well. The bottom line, and you know, the story we've been telling for a few years, is that giraffe have been in trouble. There's no doubt about it. And we'll look at the numbers in a minute. But it's one of those things that people just didn't think. The bottom line for giraffe is that they're a prey, you know, or a prey animal, and they're a large prey animal, and they provide, you know, some good food source for a lot of predators out there. But they are in trouble. And the perception is, we've done it. Huh? I'm just going to move it off. They're in trouble, but the perception is giraffe are everywhere. If anyone has been on a safari, they always think, okay, in Etosha National Park, you see giraffe. If you go to the Serengeti, the Masai Mara, etc., giraffe are literally everywhere. So that's been the perception for all of these years. Unfortunately, it's not quite that way. In the last, give or take, 300 years, there's been an almost 90% decline of giraffe across their range in Africa. You could probably mirror this with many animals, in particular something like black rhino, which has a very similar range to giraffe. So it's a fairly big decline, and obviously the bottom line, it's us. We're the ones causing problem. There's too many of us. We're losing habitat at a rate of knots, And obviously, unfortunately, animals are suffering. So based on our best guess estimates at the moment, and we're still working on the next iteration of this, but in 2021, Michael led a study for us, and we estimated 117,000 giraffe in Africa. Doesn't sound that much, but let's put it in perspective. Everyone is very concerned about elephant, and so we should. African elephant, there's two types of African elephant. How many do you think there are? They are. In comparison, giraffe numbers are considerably less. The best estimate of elephant at the moment, give or take, but maybe Colin will have a go at me for this, is about 450,000, 400,000, 450. There's relatively, I think, a shed load out there, especially when you put it in comparison to giraffe. But this narrative is not getting out there. Big conservation organizations who have obviously the marketing budget to, obviously profess how, threatened and endangered elephant are, and they need help, are not really doing the same thing for giraffe. So in essence, there's one giraffe for every 4 elephant in Africa. It's not a good sign for them. And that's just giraffe, one of the most iconic animals in the world. What about all these other critters out there who need attention and need support? So if we can't save one of the most iconic animals in the world, we're going to struggle to save all the rest. But what are the threats? Various threats. Whether it's human encroachment, animals living in community areas as the population grows, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation. We've got this great train line that's running through a part of Niger in West Africa. This train line was built, obviously, to run freight and whatnot to Nigeria. It's split a habitat a little bit. They don't own a train. There's been no train ever run through there for the last decade. So a great use of development dollars right there. But poaching, quite large in certain areas. In Namibia, we do also have incidences of poaching that occur, more subsistence, sort of not on a very commercial scale, but in other parts of Africa, there is much more poaching. And giraffe, as you may know or not, in 2019 was added to CITES Appendix 2, because lots of people, sort of raised a bit of attention and support to be able to say that international trade was having an effect on giraffe. It's not. There is no value in the CITES listing of giraffe, full stop. Unfortunately, the biggest problem is domestic trade, local trade in certain areas. So a listing of that looks great for many lawyer conservation organizations out there, but unfortunately is not having a benefit for giraffe in the wild. So behind all of this is what we're seeing for every species out there in the world that is struggling. It's not a singular problem. There are so many things, and one place is very different to the other. There's no cookie cutter approach that you can say, well, let's do this here. We're going to save giraffe there. Unfortunately, it's not that. So in each place, we have to do something different. We have to look at new ideas, new tools. But a couple of years ago, it was quite nice that Sir David Attenborough, when we were doing a documentary with the BBC, had highlighted that giraffe were going through what they call a silent extinction. And for years, people have always said that giraffe don't make noises. But maybe that was the pun that we were trying to get, that there was this silent extinction. Those numbers, as you see, were going down. Elephant numbers were far more. But there's so much we just don't know about giraffe. So does any of you know what that sound is? It was quite faint. It was a giraffe. So giraffe are not silent. That was a giraffe in distress, admittedly. But giraffe make lots of noises. Snorts, snuffs, gruffs, screams, vocalizations. So if we don't know that about giraffe and the world is perpetuating this idea that giraffe are silent, how are we going to save these animals before it's too late? So behind what we started in 2009 was, we figured out that basically numbers were going down more than we thought. And the bottom line behind it all was we should try to do something now before it's too late. We'd heard a lot about the northern white rhino, which obviously now there's still programs trying to find the northern white rhino up in South Sudan running today. They're functionally extinct, but we're spending millions of dollars of conservation money on trying to find the last couple of individuals, or the woolly mammoth that we're trying to bring back, de-extinction. Yet we've got so many critters right in front of our eyes that we could do so much more to protect their habitat, which will protect the suite of animals that live in it. So the IUCN, if anyone's heard, it's the World Conservation Union. When someone says something is threatened or endangered, least concern, whatever the terminology, it's an organization, and behind it, it's full of volunteers. There's about 10,000 volunteers who specifically support different types of taxa. So Colin, I know, is on the elephant specialist group. Michael, myself are on the giraffe one, etc., etc. The knowledge that comes is from experts around the world, giving them information that are publishing what is the conservation status of an animal. So for giraffe, currently they believe as a specialist group, because there's been no review, that there is one species of giraffe and 9 subspecies. So when we did the assessment a couple of years ago, late 2000s, we estimated at the time a little bit less than 100,000 giraffe. That was our best estimate based on population numbers, guesstimates, etc. And looking at the decline that had been from 30 years earlier, and that was what they assess, we'd come up with that they were vulnerable. There was approximately, as I said, 30% decline. So on the IUCN red list, they're listed as vulnerable. However, 117,000 is not a huge amount of animals. And I look at sort of other animals that are far less in number and are far more threatened, what they call categories, but also the other way. There's no perfect mechanism that the IUCN has created to understand what this decline is. So that's one way the world knows about it. But we've used a little bit of science over the last 20 years, and we've figured out actually there's 4 species of giraffe, not just one. And this has been a lot of genetic work that we've done from all across the continent, sampled in every major population in Africa. So we have the Maasai, the northern, the reticulated, and the southern. There's lots of different couple of different subspecies underneath them. In Namibia, we only have southern giraffe. And within that, there's southern giraffe, there's the Angolan, which is the predominant giraffe we have here, but also a couple of South African giraffe, in particular in Bobwata National Park, which is quite interesting. Genetically, extremely distinct. So quite odd. And if you look at the pattern, you could probably all say, well, when I was in Etosha last, I saw one that looked like that one, and I saw one that looked like that one, or one that looked like a bit of all of it. Coat pattern has been used for years to define this one species and 9 subspecies. Unfortunately, it's not a really good tool to use. Geography is critical, but genomics is really the only way we've been able to divide these critters up. And that's really important if we're trying to conserve them properly. Because we said before, what was it, 117,000 giraffe. So now you've got 4 species that have been clearly identified. You split them up, obviously the numbers start to reduce. The northern giraffe, hi guys, how's it going? The northern giraffe, which is across a lot of these sort of naughty countries in the continent, not great places for holidays or hanging out, bringing kids. But, you know, in the 1990s, estimate 27,000. Today, around 6,000 individuals remaining in the wild. So put that in context, not the 117,000. This is a unique species. And underneath that is actually 3 subspecies. One of them numbers, the West African, about 600 odd in the wild today. They, as a 600 giraffe, are actually listed as vulnerable, not critically endangered, not endangered. So how are we supposed to convince the Niger government, one of the poorest countries in the world, to help conserve the last remaining population? There's none in zoos anywhere in the world. If the experts, which includes us, can't even figure out how many species of giraffe there. There's lots of politics in conservation. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly, but things like that are really impacting what we are doing and what we're trying to save. Reticulated giraffe, one of the most beautiful looking giraffe, Kenya, mostly into, a little bit maybe into Ethiopia, Somalia, but we'll be honest, we have no clue. A little bit dodgy areas to go and hang out, but we do have some surveys going on in some of these areas. You can see that, yeah, the decline is there, almost, approximately 50% in the last 30 years or so. So that's only 16,000 reticulated giraffe left in the wild. Maasai giraffe was the most numerous. They're predominantly in southern Kenya and in Tanzania. There's a little bit of a population in Rwanda, and then the Luangwa giraffe, or people have been calling the thorny cross giraffe, which today we had a good discussion, actually was first named the North Rhodesian giraffe, which I'd forgotten. But they also have declined by, quite a percentage. And really, those three giraffe that I've just shown you, because they're different species, by doing an assessment on them independently, they all come out as endangered or critically endangered, which actually opens up the reality of how we need to conserve them and why we need to conserve them. At the moment, as I said, vulnerable, so they don't get the conservation attention. The world looks at giraffe as one species, but if we start splitting them up, this is where we can get more attention, more funding, more support to be able to do something. But it's not all doom and gloom. The southern giraffe. Here, South Africa, Zimbabwe, predominantly in Botswana, we're doing well. And I think the numbers will even be higher than this moving forward. But we've got amazing conservation. Government, private, community, all trying to conserve giraffe as well as other animals. And this is what we need the support from. And this is what we need to be able to show the world, that Namibia is not just perceived to be a hunting mecca. They're actually conserving animals for long-term biodiversity. So overall, about a 20% increase we have noticed in a 5-year period. And this is the story we've got to start telling more, not the silent extinction. No negative conservation story has helped an animal in the wild. So we've got to start telling the more positive story. And that's why we're here tonight, to obviously tell them and want everyone to be a voice for giraffe. So this is what we came up with as our mantra through COVID. We all had to come up with something because we had nothing better to do. But being a voice for giraffe is who the Giraffe Conservation Foundation is. We're made up of a crazy group of team. I think I still left Clary up there. And then obviously Nikki's there. So we, I think at the moment, are 19 people from 11 or 12 different countries. Our board is from 5 different continents that we're made up from. We have a base in the US as our a fiscal base, but our operational base is in Namibia. We started all of our giraffe conservation work here in the late 1990s, and everything essentially I think that we have done to date since can be proudly born in Namibia. I think that's really cool, and Michael will show you a whole bunch of stuff later, and all of that was first trialed in this country. We work currently in 19 African countries. I always say that, when I was a little bit younger, I had a little bit more hair, not as gray. I've never had a beard before, that's just new. But working across all these countries is hard work. We have set up the first national strategies, regional strategies for giraffe in these countries. None of that existed before. I'm not going to go through the work, but everything from surveys to genetics to environmental education to training is if there's giraffe work, there'd be no doubt that GCF in one way or another has been involved. But it's not just us. We are this catalyst. We work closely with partners, whether it's government, whether it's the Smithsonian, whether it's African Parks, Peace Parks Foundation. We have agreements essentially with all of these large organizations. And at the moment, we have an impact from a best estimate on more than 100 million acres of giraffe conservation habitat in Africa. So It's very big, very large scale, but also very defined at the same time. We've done everything from developing education materials. All of it is available online. It's helped really, especially in the zoo world out there, to be able to share information. The zoo world, in theory, has access to about 10% of the world's population annually. And so those figures we can't access. So how do we develop the right information, the right tools to put it in the hands of those people who are talking out there? But the bottom line is giraffe can only be saved in Africa by Africans. You can't have some random Aussie bloke running around with a couple of Americans, etc., saying, okay, guys, we're going to make a difference. That's not true. It won't help. But what we have to do is get on the ground. We have to work with people. And one of the biggest things we've been able to do here is randomly, we now run the largest environmental education program in Namibia. This is not something we started out doing, but now we take about 3,000 kids a year in the Commerce area out into Danfuljuan and spend a day going through curriculum-related activities for grade 3s, grade 4 kids. It's mostly underprivileged, under-resourced kids that come out of Katatura, Commersdale, but we have obviously everyone through to St. Paul's and St. George's. Good thing is St. Paul's and St. George's help to fund the kids coming out of the other schools. But no school is charged if they can't afford it, and bringing these kids out into the field is something which our team, unfortunately not here tonight, have been doing now for, I don't know, 7 years or something like that, and they've taken the best part of 17,000 Namibians out into the field. These are our future leaders of the country. And that program has grown. We now have a nature workbook. We work across the continent, providing the same tools and materials. So for us, it's really critical that education is key. Hi, guys. But education as a baseline is not just for kids. It's also, we literally just finished this last week, a African wildlife veterinarian course. It's the second course we've now hosted in Namibia, working with UNAM, with NUST, and a lot of mentor wildlife vets in the country who are some of the most amazing veterinarians, I think, in the world. And so we've now had kids from, when I say kids, we've had wildlife veterinarians from, I think it would be 12 African or 13 African countries now that we've helped train. And together those people now work in more than 50 million acres of conservation land in Africa. All a mobile wildlife immobilization course, hands-on drugs. They get registered at the Veterinary Council here, and they get out there and they involved hands-on in conservation efforts. Everything is connected to a program. It's not bringing down an animal for just the fun of it, whether it's putting a satellite tag or a translocation or a movement internally to another fenced area. And it's all run by Dr. Sarah Ferguson, who's our wildlife veterinarian and our head of our conservation health program. She's an American who's been now with us for a number of years. She was based in the field in Uganda. And so she set up this course working with probably many of the people that you know, like Mark Jago, H.O. Reuter, Pete Morkel. All of these guys were out in the field this last week helping train not just wildlife veterinarians, but also the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism game capture team. So this is something giraffe in particular is they don't get hands-on a lot. We obviously spend a lot of time with giraffe, and everyone wins. And this is the most important thing. GCF is about building capacity, building support. If we can do that, we can make a huge difference. So I'm going to leave it there and let Michael now take over.
Thanks, Julian. Hi, everyone. It's a real treat to see you all up here, and I'm excited to have a chance to chat a little bit about science with you. At Giraffe Conservation Foundation, we are a science-based organization, and our goal is to use science to act decisively and to address conservation needs. Now, I know there's a lot of folks in the room who are involved in conservation. There's a lot of folks in the room who are also heavily involved in science, and I'm sure you guys don't need any convincing that oftentimes conservation management and science operate on different timescales and use different vocabularies. And so trying to operate in both of these realms keep your toes in both of these pools is oftentimes a challenge. In scientific research, we're often bound by academic timelines, novelty biases, and trying to publish new things as opposed to repetitive critical information, peer-reviewed scrutiny, and really focusing on nuance, as opposed to conservation management, and I'm painting with broad strokes here, but it's oftentimes rooted in crisis management, putting out fires, limiting risk as much as possible, focusing on management metrics, which are oftentimes very simple. We want very clear, direct messaging, things like confidence intervals and p-values aren't as valued there. But in the middle of that Venn diagram, we're looking at evidence-based decision-making and systems-level understanding. And that's why we're trying to operate as an organization, using the best available science, the best available data at any particular moment to make the best decisions possible. So if science is to act in service of conservation, what are the most useful metrics? What spatiotemporal scales are most useful for inference? How do we maximize the utility of data? How do we get the most out of every conservation dollar to make sure that the information that we're generating can be useful to the broadest audience? How do we integrate data into conservation management? How do we coordinate data and lessons learned across sites? We don't need to reinvent the wheel necessarily. Fortunately, we work in enough places where we can take lessons learned from different places and apply them as a way to sort of streamline processes. But to do that, we need to ensure that our data and inferences are translatable across sites, which requires a bit of planning, a bit of thought, and some systems level thinking. So ecology and these complicated ecosystems, I often try to think of them as a beautiful impressionistic painting, or I think if there's any art critics out there, this is more technically pointillist. But a lot of this stuff depends, the emergent properties, the things you see, depend on the scale and perspective at which you view them. So to effectively understand any ecosystem, we need to really look at it across multiple scales and try to understand ecological processes that can operate at the individual level, at the population level, and then if we're thinking of giraffe across continent, as we do, we need to be able to scale this up and look at regions, countries, and continents. And again, trying to come up with systems and questions and studies that sort of address all of these scales so that we can jump between them as we inform conservation management. So to try to wrap our head around this, we're going to focus on two specific ecological processes or subdisciplines, and how we as an organization try to use science to inform conservation management through them. The first of them is population ecology, and then the second one we're going to be focusing on is movement ecology. So I'm sure many of you guys know this, but giraffe are really, really helpful in terms of population ecology, in that they come with their own, did we break off there? Nope, we're still on, cool. That giraffe come with their own name tags. Every giraffe has a unique spot pattern, and we can use this to identify them as individuals, which is extremely helpful. A lot of our work, a lot of our population monitoring is rooted in what we call individual-based photographic surveys. So it's essentially someone driving around these tracks looking for giraffe. When they find them, they take pictures of them, and then we can run them, these photographs, through a dedicated, did we lose me? You want to hop back on? Yeah. One moment, please. Okay. Now we just gotta. Right, but I can't see it on mine. Yep. Thanks, guys. So we take these photographs and we can run them through, we have specialized software and database programs that can essentially extract the pattern from these images, and we can match them up against previously identified giraffe, kind of like a fingerprint. The software is actually very similar to like what police use for identifying criminals from fingerprints. And from this, we can create these capture histories of unique individual giraffe. So this one, for instance, was one we first saw in December of 2017 over a series of surveys. We sort of watched it grow up into a young subadult male, last seen in March 2020. Now, if we do this for thousands of giraffe, we can run it through mark recapture models to estimate abundance, or we can do things like estimating survival, reproduction, all those sort of useful demographic parameters that we really need to understand across populations. Now, when we scale this up, we can learn some really cool things about giraffe abundance and distribution and how it changes over time. So I spent a lot of time in Uganda looking at these processes, and we've developed an individual-based database for all giraffe in the country of Uganda. So every giraffe in Uganda, at least ones that were born up until, 2 months ago, should, in theory, be in this database. We have names and codes for all of them. We can track their survival, we can track their movement, we can track their social interactions over time. And this information is really, really critical. For a country like Uganda, it's been a really great story in that we've been able to document population growth in all of the major populations in Uganda very, very definitively. We can, point to the number of unique individuals, and we can show pictures of every single one to sort of map this trajectory. But in addition to all those fun demographic parameters, the science side of it, we get to learn some cool stories, some interesting histories about giraffe. This is one of my favorite ones. This is a giraffe called Maggie. She is now found in Uganda's Kidepo Valley National Park, which was a population that got really, really tiny. So tiny, in fact, that in the mid-1990s, it was down to 3 individuals. The government of Uganda teamed up with the government of Kenya. They brought in some giraffe from Lake Nakuru National Park, flew them in, dropped them off, and then didn't really monitor them after that. We first went into Uganda, teamed up with the Uganda Wildlife Authority in 2015, starting one of these individual-based photographic surveys. We were able actually to match spots on photographs from that original translocation to this one here, Maggie. This is, interestingly enough, last year when we did her survey, she was with a calf, and conservatively, she's at least 25 years old, making her one of the oldest known wild giraffe to give birth. So these are kind of the cool stories that can emerge from these repeated long-term population monitoring efforts. So to give you an idea of the scale at which we do these surveys, we have the Uganda one, but we don't just work in Uganda, we work all over Africa. We have over 100 different sites where we run these survey efforts, all 4 species, 14 different countries, and all of these sites combined account for over 30,000 individual encounters of giraffe. So some really useful large data. We have some of these flagship programs in key sites where we do some really intense monitoring, and we can compare a lot of these demographic parameters, these population growth rates across different environmental conditions, which provide some really useful information comparatively. But it also has really important policy and conservation applications. Data from these surveys has been contributed to the IUCN Red List that Julian mentioned before, but it's also contributed to national strategies in a number of different countries we work. Here we have Kenya and Uganda. So we're providing really solid abundance estimates and population growth rates from these surveys. So we're going to switch gears a little bit to something maybe a bit more fun to think about, something I'm wrapping my head around quite a bit for the last few years. This is the movement ecology angle. So some of you guys may have seen these tracking units we kind of brought in on the table here. These are part of what we call our Twiga Tracker Initiative, Twiga being the Swahili word for giraffe. So we've developed this movement ecology study across all of Africa in which we're trying to understand giraffe movement. So we work in a lot of different places, and so trying to come up with studies that integrate across all of these systems is sometimes challenging. So we've developed sort of a workflow as we come up with new studies, looking to engage with local stakeholders to identify key issues for that particular area, developing and applying the appropriate technology, which I'll talk about in a little bit, designing site-specific conservation objectives. We want to make sure that every study we do contributes to local conservation, and we do that through directly engaging with the stakeholders as we plan the studies. We also want to design site-specific research goals. Every place that giraffe live in is unique in some way, and by studying movement of giraffe in that place, we can learn something new about giraffe from there that we can't necessarily learn in other places. So we want to leverage the unique aspects of every single ecosystem we work in to tell us something new about giraffe that we don't know. But as we talked about before, we want to make sure we have this interoperability across the different sites. We want to make sure that what we learn in Uganda can help inform how we act in Namibia. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But the first step was to design and apply cutting edge technology. Giraffe are kind of goofy looking. They don't have sort of the same classical dimensions that a lot of traditional ungulates have. You can't just slap a collar on a giraffe and track it. We tried, it doesn't work. So we had to get a little creative, and over the last decade or so, maybe a little bit longer, we've been experimenting with different manufacturers, different design types to come up with the optimal giraffe tracking technology. And I'm not going to profess that we've found the perfect solution, but we've gotten better. Just to give you an idea of sort of some of the iterations, we've had these neck collars, we've had these head harnesses, we've had these ossicone mounted solar units. Now we're starting to play around with these tail units. And then we also have these new ear tag units, which I have an example of right here, really light, really small. All of these units transfer data via satellite network, so you can wake up on your computer anywhere in the world and log on and access the data and track giraffe all across Africa. So we've developed the technology, but then you have to actually put it on the animal, which is admittedly a challenge. These are two Uganda Wildlife Authority rangers bringing down a Nubian giraffe in Uganda's Murchison Falls National Park. I include this picture not for like a gratuitous wildlife capture image, but to show that it's dangerous, it's expensive, it's stressful for the animals, it's stressful for us. And so it sort of emphasizes the value of that data. We want to make sure that we get the most out of everything we collect. So how do we do that? Hangi, you might recognize some of these ones. With these units, we get lots and lots of data. We get lots of data. Anyone who's done wildlife tracking studies knows it's often difficult to manage, organize, and disseminate a lot of this information. So we've sort of pioneered the application of this new spatial software, Earth Ranger. Some of you guys may have been familiar with it. It's a protected area spatial database system. So what we do is we have all of our collars talking to this program, and anyone can log on if they have the right credentials and track the latest locations of every giraffe. And we can map it out. So Hangi here, who's working in Namibia down in Namib, he has access to these ones right here. These are some giraffe that were just translocated a few weeks ago. Each one of them had a unit on to help with some post-translocation monitoring. So he can log onto his computer anytime he wants and track the latest locations of these giraffe. What's really cool about this system, though, is we can also automate a lot of some of the analyses. So this is a fence reserve. If giraffe get outside of the fence, they need to know immediately. We have it programmed into the system, geofence alerts. So if there's any coordinate fix outside of that, he immediately gets an email or a WhatsApp. Similarly, we have immobility alerts on all of the units as well. And these are happening in real time without anyone having to do any manual analysis, which is really, really useful. This is one of the more basic applications of these data, but it's really one of the more useful ones for a lot of the conservation management. So here we have some rangers in Uganda who have an app on their phone. They can go out and they can track this giraffe that was just moved there, follow up on health, follow up on a lot of the monitoring, and find this animal in what is a massive landscape, which they otherwise would not be able to do. So it's a really useful tool for on-the-ground conservation. So to sort of zoom out and give you an idea of the scale at which we're operating here, We've deployed over the last 6-7 years over 400 units on all 4 species of giraffe in 15 countries. We've got over 2 million data points collected. And from this, we have over 14 different scientific publications. So I showed you dots on a map and what we can do for dots on a map. But dots on a map, it's not quite science. It's fun, it's cool to look at, but we want to use the information, use that data to learn something about how giraffes interact with their environment or how they interact with us. So this gets at the site-specific research that I talked about. And we're operating in a whole bunch of different places. Just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, in northwest Namibia, up in the Hwanib system, we had a master's student from the University College of Dublin looking at giraffe movement in response to thermoregulation. In Chad, we had actually a master's student from Glasgow working on seasonal space use in these flooding environments and how that makes giraffe interact with the protected area boundaries. They're seasonally moving out in response to variation in habitat selection. In Uganda, we're the first to describe migration in giraffe. We have this male bias partial migration using this telemetry data. And then we're also looking at responses to development in these areas. In a place like Mozambique, we're looking at translocation, post-translocation home range formation. When you take a bunch of giraffe and you plop them off in a new environment, how do they explore that place? How do they find the resources? How do they settle into their new home ranges? Niger, where giraffe exists exclusively outside of protected areas, what sort of temporal variation do they have in terms of how they interact with people? Are they going closer to villages at nighttime? Or are there, holidays? Niger in particular is a very Muslim country, so are there peaks in activity for giraffe when humans are less active during some of the religious holidays? In Zimbabwe, we're looking at comparative space use across hunting blocks and formerly protected areas. So all of these little specific attributes of all of these different sites can tell us something new about giraffe. And they are. They're telling us lots of really cool things, and we're getting it out. We have, like I said, over 14 different publications looking specifically at the site-specific research goals. But as Julian mentioned before, giraffe live in these incredibly diverse environments. Just here in Namibia alone, we have the Hwanib River. You saw some pictures of that before. You have Tosha Heights Private Reserve. And looking at the movements of the giraffe just over the last 2 weeks, in these very different places, they exhibit very different movement strategies. And if you sort of zoom out and look at giraffe distribution across Africa as a whole, there's an even greater diversity of these ecological gradients. I mean, you can look at this closed canopy woodland in Murchison Falls National Park to the barren pans of Etosha National Park, and then everything in between. So giraffe live across this incredible ecological gradient. And this diversity of environments gives us variation in some of these key ecological parameters that we can actually use to test how giraffe are responding to it. So this is where it gets really cool. This is where the science nerd jumps out. When we aggregate data across all giraffe at the continental scale, what are the ecological and anthropogenic drivers of giraffe space use? How are giraffe responding to, woody vegetation and ecological productivity in Uganda, where it's really green and wet a lot of the time, versus Namibia, where it's very dry almost all of the time? So we took all of our giraffe data, lump it into one big study, and this paper is actually coming out next Wednesday. I'm not supposed to tell you that, internet. But we can start to look at some of these patterns and see how they shake out at the continental scale using very systematic and uniform analytical frameworks. So that's one of the other challenging things. If you're looking at giraffe as different sites and doing this analysis at different sites, oftentimes it doesn't have the same covariate space. Oftentimes you're using different metrics to define space use. So until you can lump it all together in one big analysis, you really lack a lot of the statistical power to tell something meaningful about the giraffe movement. So that's what we've done. We've lumped it all together in one big analysis, and some cool patterns have shaken out. So we can look at giraffe space use, the home range here, the AKDE, 95%. And there is a little bit of variation. On average, we see giraffe having a home range of about 350 to 360 square kilometers, but there's variation across the species. Similarly, if we look at daily movement of giraffe at the continental scale, on average, they're moving just over 14 kilometers a day. But again, there's variation across the species. And this is where some of the science comes in. Why? Why is there variation across the different species? So if we look at home range size and movement, we can regress this using some pretty complicated mixed effects meta-regression analysis that took a long time for me to figure out. But we can compare giraffe space use in areas where there's lots of people, where there's few people, to see how they respond to anthropogenic pressures. So across all of Africa, generally as a whole, there's a statistically significant effect of anthropogenic disturbance on giraffe space use. So in places where there's a lot more people, in more urban environment where the human footprint index is higher, they're covering less area, and they're generally moving less per day. Generally, we think as a function of connectivity. If you're compressing giraffe into an area and sort of surrounding them with this inhospitable matrix, they're not going to move as far. Conversely, though, and this is kind of the cool findings, if you have a more productive environment, if you have more woody vegetation, if you have generally higher greenness, giraffe also don't move as far. They have smaller home ranges and they have a smaller daily movement because they don't need to travel as far to meet their daily requirements. The resource use sort of decreases. It's much more efficient. Where it gets really interesting, though, is when you increase the heterogeneity in anthropogenic disturbance and the heterogeneity in ecological gradient, they have to move more. So when resources are patchy, when they're interacting with low human footprint index and high human footprint index simultaneously, they've got to navigate these patchy environments. And as a result, they're moving more and they're covering greater areas. So with the conservation science, we're looking to move beyond just identifying patterns. And instead, we're moving towards describing principles that can be applied to novel systems. If we are to take a giraffe from a place where we know it exists and drop it off at a place where it's relatively new, how is it going to respond? And it's studies like that one where we have this huge variation of covariate space where we can actually start to statistically test this. And it's really valuable for informing giraffe conservation in a changing world. And the world is changing. It's changing very fast. This is an oil rig in Murchison Falls National Park where I did a lot of my PhD research. So these environments are changing very, very rapidly, and giraffe are encountering new threats, new challenges, and we need to use what we know about giraffe movement, giraffe population ecology, to help project what's going to be happening in these uncertain futures. So one of the tools we have then to address these threats, it's sort of the culmination of all of the aspects that Julian and I have been talking about tonight, are these conservation translocations. When you look at the giraffe distribution map, it's all these little isolated populations, and a lot of the movement can't happen between them. There are places where we know giraffe have been in the past. They are not there now. There's no natural way for giraffe to recolonize those areas. So we need to give them a bit of a hand. We need to use the best available science in terms of habitat use, in terms of population dynamics, to inform when and where giraffe can go. And that's something that GCF has been exceptionally good at the last few years. These are photos from just, a week and a half ago of some animals that were translocated up to conservancies up in the Northwest from Atasha Heights. So it's a very complicated process. It requires a lot of coordination with a lot of people, a lot of great science informing it, a lot of great veterinary capacity, a lot of great partnerships. And so this is where all these things come together, activities like this. Again, it requires a lot of expertise and people with experience. But it results in these really cool culminating moments. This is sort of the fun part of ecology. This is where all the papers are editing, all the statistics, all the permit applications pays off. When you get to see these animals sort of head off into their new environment. And so now these places in Northwest Namibia have what we hope will be a growing and burgeoning giraffe population, all thanks to the expertise and hard work of big teams like this. So these translocations are really important for a lot of different reasons. Ecologically, giraffe are a major keystone species in terms of driving some of these properties through intense browsing. Economically, they're a really big tourism driver, but also culturally, giraffe are really important to a lot of communities. This is a community in Uganda and Pianube Wildlife Reserve where giraffe were extirpated by, we think, 1996. Through a series of translocations, Giraffe Conservation Foundation brought giraffe back to what was historically one of their strongholds in Pianube Wildlife Reserve. What's interesting is the community there. This is the Karamojong. This particular community of the Karamojong tribe, giraffe were their totem animal, part of their culture that was erased in 1996 when they were extirpated. So when they were brought back, they welcomed them with open arms as part of their culture was sort of reestablished in this critical landscape. So again, GCF has done this in a lot of different places. We've done it here in Namibia, Uganda, all over the place, Niger. This is outdated, but just to give you an example of the scale at which we're operating, translocations in 5 different countries, over 176 giraffe moved, millions of acres of giraffe habitat restored through this culmination of all the hard work that we put together, creating multiple populations. And what's interesting is that the work doesn't end once we let the giraffe off. There's years of post-translocation monitoring to make sure that the populations are growing, to make sure that they have what they need to be healthy and happy in their new environments. And that statistic right there, 57 baby giraffe, is a testament to that. So we have a series of translocations coming up. With World Giraffe Day today, we kind of wanted to highlight that. That's one of the big initiatives we're looking to fund with donations and funds generated today. There's translocations, hopefully in Mozambique coming up, perhaps taking some giraffe to Iona National Park in Angola, reestablishing these critical populations, which is one of the messages we really wanted to get out, particularly on a day like today. So with that, I invite you. We are a voice for giraffe at Giraffe Conservation, and today especially, I invite you all to be a voice for giraffe as well. So thank you guys, and we're happy to talk about giraffe science with our remaining time. Thank you guys.
I was saying thank you very much to both of the speakers, Michael and Julian, for a really interesting presentation on the work of GCF. It's, wow, kind of impressive. So congratulations to your team, and we've got time to field some questions from the floor, but you need the microphone.
Thank you. That working? Just a comment first. By IUCN criteria, it's obvious that 3 of those giraffe species are endangered, if not critically endangered. The savanna elephant that you listed the numbers of there is claimed to be endangered. There's quite a lot of evidence that it's not. That seems scandalous to me, but it's my opinion. And coming back to the question of the separate species, in the case of elephants, we're supposed to have 2 species. There's not particularly good evidence for that. This is the question now, not a comment. What is the evidence that you have for species? What is the genetic evidence?
Okay, Julian.
Thanks, Colin. So based on, we initially started to look at, as everyone did, mitochondrial DNA, which is, obviously the female line. Then we looked at the nuclear DNA. Now we have full genome analysis of hundreds of giraffe from across all their range in Africa. And essentially what they've shown is that there was a discussion that there was hybridization in particular between many of the giraffe. In Kenya, we had 300 samples just analyzed recently. A paper is coming out, should be in the next month. And it shows there is no hybridization essentially for tens of thousands of years between any of these three giraffe, what they call admixture. So there is nothing going on. And in some of them, there is, especially between the giraffe in the northern part of Africa and the southern. So let's just say the Maasai and the southern giraffe are much more closely related. It's about 250 to 350,000 years since there was any mix between those populations. So depending on the conservation, sort of genetic tool or species concept you want to use, the old adage was that if you had two animals, they breed and they produce a viable offspring. Obviously, it was a great idea of Darwin. There's been a few things changed since then. There's lots of animals that interbreed and produce viable offspring. So our genetic results has been pretty clear. And initially, when we started this work in 2016, we first published, there was a lot of questions and concerns, and so there should be. And we've continued to do that, continue to add more data and involve sort of experts in all facets of conservation genetics. And it seems to be pretty clear that the lineages have definitely been, going off and not interbreeding, as I say, for tens of thousands of years. That's just one of the conservation tools that our genetic team look at. Does that help? So, what do you want? I can give you a whole host of papers.
No, it's my opinion. But, all the species of zebra have different chromosome numbers. Including chimpanzees and humans, donkeys and horses. I'd expect something of that sort of level to really be able to say those are real species.
You want to add?
No, there's lots of opinions, and opinions, humans all have opinions. So science seems to prove it pretty clearly in the tools that we're currently using. So, let's just say sable and rowan interbreed, produce viable offspring. We consider them different species. Coyotes and wolves, separate species, produce viable offspring. And I could go on and list at least another 20, 30 different. But so I think our view of what a species is needs to adapt. We're evolving, we understand more, we use science as the basis of it. For giraffe, in the end, we could call them John, Frank, Susie. It's not really a priority. What I would like to know and what GCF we look at is if we're moving animals around, we want to move the same ones of the same flavor. It just happens that they come up as species. They could be subspecies. That is another discussion altogether because we have no clue what really that is. But if they're the same type of animal, we want to move them in with the other same type of animal for biodiversity conservation. So that's really, I suppose, behind it all. The speciation is just to tick the box for the geneticists to keep happy.
Okay, thank you. We had a question. Do you still have a question to ask, Sven?
May I? Okay, thank you. There was a decline between 1990 and 2022 with 3 of the species that you identified. And there was a more than 50% increase in numbers of individuals with a species called southern giraffe, if I'm not mistaken, giraffe or whatever. And you briefly touched that there is a success story behind it. But what are we doing here in Southern Africa differently from the other areas? What are the factors actually that allow or contribute to this increase?
Okay, Michael, over to you.
Thanks. That's a really important distinction. If we're looking really coarsely at sort of wildlife management and conservation philosophies, I think a lot of folks in here would agree there's some notable differences between what happens in Southern Africa and what happens in East and Central Africa. One of the major ones is sort of the privatization of a lot of wildlife conservation in terms of ownership and land tenure and who owns wildlife and how it's managed. In Southern Africa, Namibia, wildlife is more intensely managed at a more private level. And when there are financial incentives to maintain wildlife, as there have been in recent years, we've seen a lot of the populations increase. And you look at some of the other populations, the Nubian giraffe, for instance, a lot of the areas where it is distributed, particularly our conflict zones, and giraffe are a lot of meat for one bullet. And so when we see those conflicts, oftentimes we see giraffe populations nosedive. Interestingly enough, in some of those conflict areas, they can respond incredibly quickly, but just given sort of the political history of that area, they haven't had the time recently to rebound. Whereas in Southern Africa, a lot of the management policies enacted 10, 15, 20 years ago are really starting to show benefits. I want to offer one quick caveat on those numbers as well. We show population increase, which is great, and I think that's true in many cases, but a lot of times it's just because of better accounting. We looked a lot harder, we dug up more reports, we talked to more people, we aggregated a lot more data than had previously been done. So it's just some of these numbers, maybe we don't quite see the same increase, we're just better at accounting it, which is I think altogether good for conservation if we can figure out ways to bring all these sources to data to make the best available decisions. Thanks.
In the distribution of giraffe over Africa, has there been any study that you know of correlating or identifying giraffe on Bushman paintings that might give an indication of what species or subspecies were in a particular area 500,000 years ago and are not there now, or a couple of 100,000 years ago anyway?
I got to be careful with the audience here. Are you a Bushman painting expert? No? Okay. No, that's a really good point. We actually do use some of that information, particularly in looking at translocation assessments. One of the criteria, one of the boxes that we want to tick is to make sure that we're not deliberately introducing them extra-liminally. We're not taking them to places where they haven't been. And if we are, we need to justify why we're doing it. It's really difficult to look at historical records that extend really before 1800. And that is just like a blip in like ecological and evolutionary timescale, right? So these paintings, these carvings are actually something we do look at. Pianupe Wildlife Reserve, for instance, the one I was talking about in Uganda, there were paintings there, and we use that as justification for including giraffe in sort of this native range. As in regards to identifying what flavor of giraffe was there, I don't know. A lot of those paintings are beautiful, don't get me wrong, but I don't think they have the level of resolution that we're looking for to make those. We can't even agree on what a species is in this room. I think it'd be a little more difficult from a Bushman painting, but yeah, it's a really useful historical record of a location of an animal. Another interesting one, actually, I'm just going to go a little bit tangent here. There are local words in certain tribal languages for giraffe in places where giraffe do not currently exist. So we've been looking at linguistic history as well as a way to sort of paint like a much coarser view of giraffe distribution as a way to kind of justify some of the decisions we make.
Okay, let's have one more question here.
Good evening. Speaking of the species that doesn't or interbreed long time ago, but not recently, is it simply because of geographical situation that they don't mix, or is it also behavior? I don't know.
That's a really good question. And I think we want to zoom in on Kenya as a way to sort of explore this, because Kenya as a country, you have to forgive me, I'm American, it's about the size of the state of Texas, and it has 3 species of giraffe in it. It's like the giraffe diversity hotspot. And it's like, why don't these animals interact? I mean, giraffe conceivably cover tens of kilometers a day. It's really no not hard to imagine that they might be able to interact. There are some biogeographical barriers that sort of limit. There's rivers, there's mountain ranges, there's, the Rift Valley escarpment. But some of it might be behavioral, some of it might be phenological. There was a paper a while back that looked at what they call a phenological barrier, that the certain species, preferred tree species, that is the boundary between two of these giraffe species, sort of greens up in a way that essentially creates a barrier for movement for giraffe across that. We're talking evolutionary timescale, so that's a little tricky to believe, but that's one of the hypotheses. And the answer is we don't have a great answer for that. It's a really good question and something we're really interested in looking at. And with some of this genetic data coming out of Kenya in particular, it'll hopefully cast some light on it. But it's really interesting to think about with all this taxonomy stuff. We're trying to put these rigid bins around what is a fluid evolutionary system. So there's always going to be gray area. But what's really cool are places like Kenya, where you have this incredible diversity, and trying to come up with the evolutionary processes and the ecological processes that drove those evolutionary processes that gave rise to this incredible diversity of giraffe that we see there. But yeah, it's a good question, and we don't know. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're kind of drying up with the questions. So I really want to say thank you very much to the two speakers. Here's a small token. Say thank you very much for both of you. Julian, you also get one. Giraffe biltong, not quite. Biltong, the best biltong in the world. Okay, but so a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much to GCF, and we wish you luck in your further work. I just want to do a brief little promotion for next week. We're having another talk session next Wednesday on pangolins, and we've got a young student who's been looking at the cultural significance that different people attach to pangolins and the kind of variations in that, and that will try and guide what sort of conservation initiatives can be done for pangolins. So we've got Kelsey Preliger in the back of the hall here. She's going to be talking, no, her student is going to be talking next week about that cultural significance around pangolins. So anyway, thank you very much, one and all, for your attention this evening. Thank you once again to GCF. We wish you all a pleasant evening. Thank you for the Zoomers. Thank you, Ruth, for taking charge of them. And good night.